In tonight's first pre-election segment, we turn to one of the referendums on the ballot. A yes vote on question 3 would outlaw discrimination on grounds of sexual identity for access to public accommodations. That means access to restrooms or locker rooms according to your gender identity as opposed to your gender at birth. Joining us to make the case for a yes vote is the executive director of the Massachusetts Trans Political Coalition, Mason Dunn. Thank you very much for being with us, Mason.
Thanks for having me.
Yes vote would keep in place things that we have on the books right now, but before those are on the books and when norms were a bit different in the state, what was it like for trans people?
Well, you're absolutely right. This law has been on the books for over 2 years now without incident or issue. But before we had this law, we know that discrimination was a major concern for many transgender people across the state. We did a survey in 2014 before we passed this law that showed that 65% of transgender people had experienced discrimination in a public space like transportation, hospitals, retail establishments, restaurants, and beyond.
So it's interesting because this is commonly called the bathroom bill, but again, people don't go to a restaurant just to use the bathroom, but I guess this affects more than just the bathroom.
Yeah, under Massachusetts law, public accommodation, which is what we're talking about here today, it means any place that's open to the public. And so we're talking about places that we use every day like libraries and public transportation, parks, restaurants. The coffee shop that I went to this morning is a public accommodation. And so what this law ensures is that I can go into those places knowing that I am protected from discrimination and harassment while I'm in public places like that coffee shop. And so, yes, bathrooms are included in as much as the coffee shop had a bathroom in it, but you're right. I don't go to the coffee shop to use a restroom. I go to the coffee shop because that's what you do in the morning. And what we as transgender people are looking to do is preserve our right to be able to be in those spaces free from discrimination and harassment.
No, I imagine earlier if somebody went into one of those spaces, a restroom, you could have walked in and somebody said, "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." What's it like to hear that?
You know, it's really hard to hear a lot of the conversations that we as transgender people are seeing on the news these days. Conversations about our humanity, our basic rights and dignity, and then to go out after watching the news or reading about this online or on social media, to then experience discrimination in those places, to be questioned about our right to be there, to be questioned on the very authenticity of our identities. It's really hard, but I think that the resiliency of our community is something that has carried us through today and ensured that we have these rights and protections. It's because of transgender people having conversations, reminding people that we are humans just wanting to have equal access to public spaces. That's what's carried us through.
Well, I'm sure you've heard arguments from the other side, the worry that someone could walk into the women's room, let's say, and they could be a convicted sex offender or could be a mom with kids in there. They're worried about that. At least that's what they say. What do you say?
Well, we've had this law on the books now for 2 years, and we haven't seen any increase in public safety threats or concerns. And in fact, a peer-reviewed study out of UCLA recently illustrated and showed that there is no increase in public safety concerns or issues as a result of passing these non-discrimination protections. On top of that, let me iterate that this doesn't change criminal law. What was a crime before we passed these non-discrimination protections is still a crime today. What we're talking about is non-discrimination protections to ensure that we can go to these public spaces and have those legal protections. It does not by any means defend criminal acts or somehow allow criminal acts to happen in restrooms or locker rooms. What's criminal before is criminal now, and we absolutely emphasize and ensure that people are safe, and that includes transgender people.
On the other hand, the entitlement to safety is also for transgender people. The way things were before, were you maybe more vulnerable to some of the things that are, that would really, make you feel uncomfortable or even unsafe?
Absolutely. Transgender people face disproportionate levels of discrimination and harassment and violence in our world today. And what we're seeking is to ensure that we have the rights and protections we need to feel safe, to feel comfortable, and ensure our privacy and the privacy of all people. and the dignity of all people in Massachusetts. And by voting yes on 3, we are making sure that we preserve those rights and dignities.
This has been the news, and we're hearing the case for a yes vote on question 3 from Mason Dunn of the Massachusetts Trans Political Coalition. Mason, there's a lot of interest in this question from the business community. What's the reason for that?
Well, inclusivity is good business practice, and ensuring that businesses are places that we can all go and all be able to, buy a cup of coffee or try on some clothes or things like that. All of that is good business practice. Now, we saw in North Carolina several years ago the impact of rolling back discrimination protections through House Bill 2 in North Carolina, which lost the state millions of dollars. And so if we do the same thing, if we roll back these civil rights protections and these basic ability for transgender people to go out into public spaces, we could see a very similar economic effect where businesses will lose money and will lose tourism, will lose all of the money associated with being an inclusive and welcoming place.
Well, another possibility that some states have contemplated in their controversy over this question is instead of having a yes or no, maybe a separate access to a place for transgender people. What about that?
Well, the fact is that we as trans people, we just want to be able to be treated like anybody else. We don't want special rights. We don't want special treatment. We don't want special rooms. We just want to be able to go about our lives, get a cup of coffee, and access public spaces like parks and libraries and everything else that goes along with being a citizen of this Commonwealth.
And I'm thinking if that were the arrangement, that could put a teenager on the spot, someone who identifies as trans but hasn't gotten approval for that from their parents.
Well, we know that a lot of trans youth in particular may not be out to their parents or are still figuring it out. And that may be true not just for trans youth, but trans adults as well. But that doesn't change our ability to go out and want to be able to be ourselves authentically and with our rights and dignity in public spaces.
Now, I imagine there might be a few situations, maybe workplace situations. I know one example given by the other side is people who do waxing in a spa, and you might have a person of one gender who feels uncomfortable working with someone who's trans. Do they have any recourse to get around that particular situation?
We want to ensure that all businesses are able to go about their daily business and ensure the safety and comfort of their employees as well as the people they serve. And so with spas and with any place, we're not changing how businesses do business. We're just ensuring that all people have equal access to that business.
One other situation that might be affected by this law is, let's say you have single-sex parents with a child, they need to use the bathroom, and they're worried about access too. How does this help them?
Well, this helps them in the fact that there are so many trans people who are parents who are now able to go out as parents and be have the same access to places as parents, as well as access for trans youth. This doesn't change anything for parents. This doesn't change anything. What we're seeking is actually just that, not to change anything, because we've had this law on the books and it's working and it's fine. And so we want to make sure that we keep this human rights and these basic dignity and privacy rights in place by voting yes on 3.
I've asked you about how not having these protections can hurt. Anything you can tell me about how having them helps a trans person?
Absolutely. And speaking from my own experience as a trans person, it means that when I go buy a cup of coffee in the morning, I know that if I experience discrimination, the state is on my side and that I can do something if I face discrimination or harassment in those public places. And it's also really important that we as a state have a reputation of being an inclusive and welcoming place that values the rights and dignity of all people. And we want to make sure we maintain that reputation by keeping this law.
Finally, we should mention that if people want some more information about your campaign, you have a place where they can look that up?
Absolutely. freedommassachusetts.org. You can find out more information, learn more about who we are as trans people and the rights that we seek to maintain and preserve here in Massachusetts.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Mason Dunn. In a moment, we'll talk with a candidate for Governor's Council.